Wonderful. Andy, would you like to say a few words, perhaps?
Now that my music is off and I'm still, figuring out how to be as smooth as you, it's taken me the whole week and I still haven't done it. For those of you who've been with me on calls this week, I apologize. But we'll get there eventually, or maybe we won't. It's difficult to live up to Vivek's, I don't know, preternatural, some might call it, preternatural caramel smoothness.
I hear you.
It's wonderful to be with you, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us. It's Friday. While we don't pay much attention to the Julian calendar, it is still sometimes worth celebrating, and this is a reason that we find for celebration, so we'll take it. Thank you for giving up some of your Friday to join us. We are incredibly privileged to have Kei Kreutler with us. She is somewhere in Denver too, and has very, very kindly agreed to host this guild nevertheless.
तो उसके लिए भी आप texted Tobies, अभी तक उसका मतलब आया नहीं है कुछ revert, but वो वाले links मैं update कर दूंगी उसी वाले doc में. फिर वो भी ticketing वाला system भी हम लोग उसमें flow वाला वो डाल देंगे वो वाला. So I think that is sorted. By economy वाला.
My bad about that. Please excuse me. So we will, in a moment, hand over to Kia to go through an incredible post that she wrote some time ago on a prehistory of DAOs. The guild will, of course, unfold in many different ways over the course of the next 6 weeks. But we begin, as we always do in Kernel, with some care and attention given to all of the different streams from which we have come and which have led to us being together in this particular moment right now. It is not for nothing that we are hosting these sessions, and honestly, I cannot think of anyone better placed than Kia to kick us off. The other really kind and wonderful person who will be co-hosting this guild over the course of the next 4 sessions is also with us and is also in Denver. His name is Isaac Patka. And you will get to meet and interact with Isaac more over the course of the following sessions, though he is present in the call now, and you can feel free to give us a wave, Isaac. There you are. It's wonderful to see you walking. That reminds me that there is also a walkie-talkie Junto, Punto, Convo, whatever we're calling it these days, which I strongly encourage you to join at some stage. Sid hosts them. They're wonderful. If you have signal where you are and can walk and talk, it's a wonderful way to be. Isaac is demonstrating it for us right now. And so that I can stop rambling and we can get into the prehistory of DAOs, I will hand over to Kia. Kia, thank you so much. It's truly an honor to have you back. Thank you for everything you do and for who you are.
Cool. Thank you, Andy. And thank you for the warm introduction. And welcome, everyone. I'm super glad to be leading this DAO Guild again with Isaac. This time we'll do something a little bit different, where each of the sessions basically will take place with a different prompt, kind of Dungeons and Dragons style, where 1,000 people have joined your Discord overnight. What do you do in the morning? Sort of style, and basically respond as it goes to different DAO scenarios. So we'll try to do some kind of scenario-driven DAO experimentation and learn about tooling and learning about potential different forms of voting and governance and scenario management for DAOs. The first session will be a little bit different, so you'll have to bear with me. I will be doing a presentation based on my prehistory of DAOs essay. It will be about 20-25 minutes probably. I know that a lot of you already participate in DAOs and are familiar with them, so forgive me if any of it is redundant. But it will basically just serve as an introduction to get us all on the same page with a little bit of context. And then there will be a brief pause for any questions, and then a little bit more about the kind of objectives and play that we can do as a group. And then I think we'll move to Gather Town for some introductions to get to know each other better. And I'm really looking forward to kind of meeting more of you and learning more about what y'all do. So yeah, again, welcome. I'll share my screen and just get started. Oh, could you please give me access to screen sharing? I cannot.
For you, you can share your screen.
Have it now, Kia, or not quite yet?
Yep, got it. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Can.
Cool, fantastic. And forgive me if it's slow or rambly. Denver has been tiring but wonderful. So the term DAO, as most of us know, stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And it comes from imagining how features of decentralized technology, such as global digital assets, censorship resistance, and automated actions, will change how organizations operate. And I call it a chimeric term because it's a kind of mashup of all of these imaginaries and more. You could also potentially describe them today as internet native organizations, although I think that they won't be internet native or internet kind of first forever. The term DAO first appeared in the Ethereum blockchain community in 2014. However, before that, there was a similar term DAC, so Decentralized Autonomous Company or Corporation, that was in kind of Bitcoin and blockchain space before that, but the more generalizable term emerged in 2014. And the first experiment under the term the DAO was called the DAO. And it launched as a decentralized funding organization and raised over 150 million in Ether in 2016. But as most of us know, the experiment proved short-lived, and sadly the DAO was hacked 1 month after launch. And it took a couple of years, I think, for like mainstream DAO experiments to gain traction again. But that didn't stop different groups from building, and also like a storied DAO history that's fallen a little bit in the wayside now. So there was the DAO hack, and then there was also Aragon DAO Stack Colony's work throughout that and after. Also a big event was Moloch DAO summoning, which you might know as DAO House now, and I believe the Moloch V3 launched yesterday. There's Meta Cartel, there's Comma DAO, Collabland, Snapshot, Flamingo DAO. So a lot of things have happened in its relatively short lifespan as a term. And while there's been a lot of practical examples now, I would say that there's also like largely a term driven by certain imaginaries of what organizations could be. And in large part, a kind of reaction, I would say, to the failure of many, or let's say like the missing quality of many contemporary institutions and public institutions to provide for civic welfare, and a kind of desire to provide models and then kind of bring them back to civic or public realm. And some of the imaginary qualities behind DAOs are the idea that they're autopoietic, like self-making, that they're hyperscalable or super scalable, that they involve a lot of members, or that they can make a larger impact. Also that they're permissionless, meaning anyone can enter and exit. That they're co-owned as a core kind of meme of DAOs today. The idea that members should have some form of co-ownership of the assets of the DAO. Also, perhaps I think the most interesting in the long run is the idea that they're mnemonic organizations. This means they're kind of like memory making organizations, in the sense that there's an idea that their institutional history of decision making and their processes will be public to some degree, and that also their kind of history of actions will be recorded in a way that stays legible over longer spans of time. Of course, all of these are far from being really instantiated yet, but I would say that they inform a lot of what we think about DAOs today. And I would say that while the term DAO is new, the ideas behind it aren't. A term related to DAOs is networks, a kind of popular term among think tanks of the 20th century, and featuring largely in this 1995 RAND report. So RAND is a nonprofit, like think tank organization that actually advised the US government and military from its inception in the 40s to today. So not without heavily strong imperial and political biases. So I don't present this necessarily as to be taken one-to-one here. But I think it's important because we inherit certain lineages potentially without being fully aware of them sometimes when you work in technology. So this report called Tribes, Institutions, Markets, Networks by David Ronfeld was published in 1995. And it gave you the very kind of familiar stages of civilization narratives claiming we moved from tribes, institution, markets, networks. And we find ourselves in a nascent form of networks today. And a core idea is not that one phase replaces another, but that it kind of expands affordances and functionality and both curtails and supports previous forms. And for our purposes, like we'll focus on a little bit of networks at the moment because a lot of the language is very similar to the language that we use around DAOs now. So a key distinguishing feature from organizational forms preceding it, outlined in the report, is that networks are described as multi-organizational, and that they facilitate the growth, this is a quote, of distributed web-like global enterprises and increasingly so-called virtual corporations. And neither public nor private, the primary domain of the multi-organizational networks is a third autonomous social sector, which the report identifies as civil society. And I think I included this diagram by wonderful friends in the essay, because I think that unconsciously or not, it kind of pulls on the lineage to some degree of Rand. If we see this diagram and then if we go back to the TIMN report, we see some synergies there. So both on an aesthetic level and I think on an ideological level, there's been some inheritance that's happened here. And in that degree, with the report's emphasis on civil society, 3-letter acronyms for organizations, NGOs, NPOs, and PVOs, private voluntary organizations, a future one starts appearing naturally missing, kind of within this lineage, as DAOs. So what are DAOs today? What do they look like? Oh, wow, 2021 is next year already. And so I think it's nice to give some concrete examples of DAOs, but I also think it's really important to remember that they're not reducible to the kind of technical tools that support them, but really are kind of social institution and social practice. And as Ava tweeted, DAOs are not products, they're frameworks for decision-making about products. And if your DAO is successful, you shouldn't even know it's there. It's just kind of a well-functioning community. Or what I would say is that it's a well-functioning kind of loosely line of sight group of organizations working together. And the DAO landscape has totally exploded. It's been interesting to see. I compared this to the DAO landscape chart from, I guess it was like 2018, and it's hilarious how different it is. And in 2021, often DAOs were described in their simplest form as a group chat and a bank account, which I think leaves a long way to like realizing they're imaginary that I mentioned before. But concretely, this is often what they are today, which is a Discord server. And they begin as a Gnosis safe multi-sig often, or some kind of contract to hold funds that has a decision-making protocol wrapped around it. So we have Discord and Gnosis safe. So Gnosis safe is a multi-sig, and this is the Uniswap grants multi-sig that decides on different grant proposals. We also have DAOs like Pleaser DAO, which collect different NFTs in the safe. So it's the idea, almost a kind of, I would say, the most institutional practice of crypto, and I mean it in the social science, economic sense of institutions, that it's a practice often that groups will come together and have a multi-sig. So just for those who aren't familiar, a multi-sig is something where you could have, often it's said M of N, but you can say like 3 out of 6 signatures. So 3 out of 6 confirmations. If there are 6 friends who are owners of the account, 3 of them need to confirm a transaction for it to go through. Hence like multi-signature or multi-confirmation. So what you have is something that kind of resembles a traditional joint bank account, except right now it can be pseudonymous and kind of cross-jurisdiction. And for anyone who's tried to do a kind of cross-jurisdictional bank account for company or otherwise, it's for most of us, it's like virtually impossible. It's very time consuming. And often around these kind of shared funds, like held in common funds, whether it's NFTs or other forms of assets, you have some form of protocol or decision-making wrapped around them. So this is a screenshot from the snapshot space, which by default in its early days used coin voting, but now has many other strategies. It involves quadratic voting, ranked choice voting. You can do NFT, so one NFT per vote, and if you have an identity system. So a pretty flexible platform, but does off-chain, and you sign on-chain for different transactions. So I would say, because most DAOs represent governance rights through a token, in some sense, tokens could Trojan horse principles of cooperatives directly into highly financialized spaces. So we have the means of member co-ownership really easily. Normally a path would be having to do a company that goes public, and then also shareholders are not related to the mission of the organization necessarily at all. So by taking this as a little meme, we can say like, oh, tokens and membership and co-ownership from the start gives us the ability to bring cooperative principles directly to DAOs. This is not at all set in stone. DAOs, there are many DAOs that don't take these principles to heart, but there are definitely some that do. And the question of like tokenization and ethics is definitely a longer one. And also the form of economics and kind of profit model that these orgs take is also a much longer one that we won't touch on a ton. But I would say for DAOs with the mission of economic value creation, a token becomes a useful mechanism on 3 fronts. So bootstrapping funding, operating across jurisdictional borders, and also coordinating at larger scales, in the sense that you can kind of pull a wide range of token holders very easily compared to other forms. And in terms of tokenization, I would say as a guiding star, Web3 applications could aim to introduce value in relations which have been historically denied it, such as labor and environment, rather than creating new financialized relations. So kind of looking at what externalities have never been accounted for, and trying to account for them through DAO economics, you could say, would be one fruitful place to start, and would also be helpful in terms of combating the places where we don't want either in practice or psychologically to be over financialized. So thinking about cooperatives, we had networks as a type form before, and now looking at cooperatives and how they relate to DAOs more closely. So it's become popular in the space to share these now, which I really love. They're the Rothschild principles for cooperatives. So they were originally drafted in 1844 by a society of weavers. And they've been in practice since, and basically they're also still embraced by the International Cooperative Alliance today. And they've evolved slightly since 1844, but for the most part, they've remained the same. So very resilient principles. And they are voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information. And I really like this one, cooperation among cooperatives. I think there's something very special and potentially more untapped there. And concern for community. And I would say the cooperative principles have largely entered this space originally through the work of people like Nathan Schneider. So this is a graphic from one of his essays in 2019 now, called Exit to Community. And basically he outlines a third path that different companies can take. Usually they tend towards IPO, so kind of going public and having shareholders, or corporate acquisition, so sell to a competitor who wants to strip it for parts. The third way he outlines is exit to community. So share what you've created with the people who value it most. And this doesn't mean it has to be blockchain or token based, but you could imagine an example where a platform, say looking at how Uniswap, Tornado Cash, even Prime DAO, others, basically have built products that is really useful to a specific community, and then has chosen when they to share that value with the community and also do different forms of governance experiments with it. But basically just being able to give the actual users and owners kind of control rather than pseudonymous shareholders or large mega corps. And so a lot of, there's this great essay by or paper by Moshe Menon called Fostering Worker Cooperatives with Blockchain Technology, Lessons from the Colony Project. It's free online, I definitely recommend reading it. And in the paper, he outlines several problems that cooperatives face. Also, of course, learnings that they've had, but often there's difficulty with fundraising initially. This is in part sometimes a good thing because there's a limitation for a lot of co-ops on how much private funds they can raise, because since they're not profit oriented, but also because their investment is very important to their mission and the aims. It's limiting kind of investment that might not be aligned with aims for care. But there's still a struggle because of those limitations to find sometimes investors who would be most amenable. There's also proven issues in studies of cooperatives governing across borders. So this is both difficulty of basically establishing different cooperative legal structures and having them relate to each other across different jurisdictions, because cooperative as a legal structure varies slightly from place to place. And relatedly, also sometimes they struggle maintaining kind of like cultural and operational coherence while growing. There can be kind of different values and different principles, which I think is a plus, but does kind of limit the network of cooperatives that I think could be a really powerful form. And so some of the DAO patterns that we see is that DAOs tend to be pretty good, not always for the best reasons, but tend to be pretty good at bootstrapping funding and providing kind of models that people get excited about for initial funding. Operating across jurisdictional borders. So right now, Ethereum is kind of still has its aim as like world's computer, and also coordinating at larger scales. So the idea, in part related to them being permissionless in some sense, many more people can get involved and therefore can signal more easily. Of course, there are limitations. It isn't a perfectly accessible system. But I would still maintain that it's much more accessible than the existing financial system. Another type form, and so I would say that that's potentially the kind of DAO patterns that can help with co-ops. But of course, there are many cooperative patterns that can help with DAOs, whether it's one member, one vote, long-termism, capped returns. So the idea that investments can exceed a return of a certain value, many patterns. And I have some resources at the end of the talk related to those that you can read more on. Another type form along with networks and cooperatives that I think is relevant for DAOs are gaming guilds. So in MMOs, multiplayer online games, players are usually free to set their own goals, loosely guided by the open game world narrative. And referred to in MMOs broadly as guilds, clans, or alliances, these groups average in size between 40 to 150 participants, and their goals can include defeating difficult enemies or constructing useful tools. For example, this megaship, which you could consider almost like a large-scale public works project that was constructed by an alliance in EVE Online. It was a really feat of coordination because they had to keep the building of it basically hidden from all of the other alliances. And it required a lot of obfuscation and like even getting the supplies, and yeah, so it's a very astounding feat for mostly strangers online. And one kind of practice that guilds are instrumental in is the distribution of loot. So loot are usually in-game items that can be usually only picked up at the aftermath of a battle or some sort of confrontation. They're usually kind of dropped by the enemies once they disappear. And loot items like armor or tomes can be more useful for some players than others. So if you're a wizard, maybe a staff is more important. If you're a warrior, armor more. So they're objects with like differing value to differing people. And as well as they have their own form of rarity as well. And in World of Warcraft, uniquely, loot cannot be transferred between players. And I was super happy to see, I don't know, a couple of month ago, when Vitalik wrote the Soulbound piece, and and this he references in World of Warcraft, the fact that loot cannot be transferred between players it's called Soulbound Loot. So it's the idea that kind of once you pick up that item, you can actually never give it to anyone else in the game. And this creates a lot of interesting affordances for how loot is distributed, because obviously there's like a clearly high stake. If it's different value for different people, it's valuable and you can't transfer it after. That's kind of like a pretty big deal about who gets it, right? So there's been a bunch of different basically approaches to how loot can be distributed. One that was highlighted in Dragon Kill Points, a summary white paper by Castronova and Fairfield, is a kind of more generalizable practice. And DKP, because they're called Dragon Kill Points because they originally evolved in relation to often larger raids or missions would be kind of killing a dragon. So in practice, DKP act as a private money system, separate from kind of any existing currency in a game world. And they're distributed to guild members based on their participation in raids. It's a little bit more complex than that, but we can say like if you participate and someone kind of gets a loot item, you get distributed some of that payment. And they look at one particular case of the leftovers, which is actually a cross-guild system, but kind of a semi-autocratic kind of debated culture of a couple of people who tried to fairly determine prices of different loot items. And then those items become purchasable for DKP. So this kind of private money system. And it's worked out very well across different guilds, and there's been different kind of groups that have taken it and slightly changed it over time. But it's really interesting for us for a few reasons. So we have kind of guild patterns. DKP is one of them, so how to distribute kind of loot, and also autonomous dispute resolution. So as a corollary, in this case of say the leftovers, often different groups, like there might be there's of course occasionally disputes about who got loot or why or who should get it. And that often these disputes, I don't think any in the case of the leftovers have ever gone to like a traditional court system. Instead, there's different processes and protocols in-game or kind of online to be able to resolve these disputes. So there's a lot of practices here that can be looked to because on-chain dispute resolution is still a really nascent field, let's say. And also why DKP is interesting is that you could say that with the leftovers council that decides on the kind of loot prices, and then people can freely choose to buy them or acquire them, that you could see this as a kind of market allocation of goods that are initially and fundamentally publicly owned. So a kind of market socialism behind it. And this really helps us with certain DAO dilemmas. Like I often struggle with the term like reputation systems, because like credit scores are something we definitely don't want to be building. And also just codified reputation is really difficult. But since it's fundamentally online, there does need to be, I think almost like we should think of it more as like membership systems or something else. But there does need to be a way by which people can meaningfully contribute and receive something meaningful back in return, whether that's payment or something else. And so I think DKP is really good because rather than showing up to a call or Discord emoji reacting, the participation in the raid shows like complex, sustained collaboration over time. And it's through that kind of proof of participating in a more complex task that you get an extra reward. And I don't think it should be super reward based, but just more meaningful contributions should also have more meaningful rewards rather than the gameable systems that we have right now. There's also the issue of distribution, which DKP looks at, and the question of trust. So people, even myself, sometimes I find myself using the word trustless just because it's such a habit in the space. But I think it's not necessarily that blockchain intermediates trust, but more so that it disintermediates like institutional trust. So we don't need to trust hopefully like an institution. You could say the protocol is the institution, but hopefully we don't need to trust an institution for us to be able to trust each other. And having autonomous dispute resolution and trust that we can kind of directly resolve any issues that we may face are really necessary for DAOs now. And I think that guilds are also interesting because they have a similar kind of political chimeric quality as well that DAOs do. So as researcher Joshua Citarella points out, many DKP systems resemble a form of market socialism in which goods are publicly owned but allocated by markets. And the term shadow economics may be apt for when a group operates through an economic form it would never label itself as. So most DAOs would not embrace the term digital cooperatives, and most gaming guilds would not necessarily, this is from surveys of different kind of gaming communities, would probably not fully explicitly identify as market socialists. And this is why I think it's different now, and I think we've been seeing this put to the test and seeing how we will resolve these issues. But I think that we should be building organizing platforms owned by users and workers, where it doesn't matter that someone tweets something that you might disagree with, but whether or not they're helping us reach concrete political objectives. So I think that it's not necessarily that someone should be in a position of leadership if they are hateful towards certain communities. I think that that is not the case. I do think that there are a lot of minor disagreements, not related to previous incidents, but there are a lot of minor disagreements that should not prevent us from working together towards concrete political objectives. Because I think if we keep having Twitter as a medium and communication space, it's really not a medium that we can have thoughtful exchanges on. And I would say that related to this, there's a huge capturability and a huge, we're gonna have to face a lot of ethical questions related to DAOs and as a community. And we've hardly faced any of them yet, just a handful. And that they're incredibly capturable as institutional forms. On the flip side of this, there's also an opportunity. I would say that in DAO's ambiguity and ahistoricity, there is an opportunity for collaboration across existing divides. So we often see in different political movements, sometimes very strong, and let's say in climate, for example, we see very strong aesthetics already paired with them and very strong language. And there's already many corporations who are kind of embodying this aesthetic and language, but not actually changing their structural practices, right? So in the way that DAOs are informed, we can kind of also create new aesthetics and new languages beyond existing aesthetic forms that we have for given causes. So DAOs after 2021, we're here now. What are they? So I think since this essay, basically, there has been a lot more, and not because of this essay, but just because of the space, there has been a lot more discussion about how DAOs don't need to be leaderless, but leaderful. So this is kind of related. So DAOs will not be, in my opinion, the uniformly non-hierarchical networks some imagine. Instead, DAOs coordinate across different levels of coherence and trust. So I think DAOs can be flat. DAOs can also have hierarchical pockets. I think we could look at them as several different layers and a network topology. So we have a token, and we have multi-organizational networks aligned by token ownership. We have teams, so teams, guilds, and squads represented by token ownership, as well as regular forms of payment. And we have missions. So these can be, I'm not a huge fan of bounties, because bounties can be a product built only by bounties ends up a really structurally unsound house. But I think longer term missions where several different groups are working together on them with roughly aligned objectives could be really powerful, and having them kind of sprint or cycle based at their core. And from these layers, a hierarchical network emerges, meaning an organization that possesses the ability to be ranked in multiple ways. And I think if a culture is healthy and there is kindness in an organization, it matters less whether there's hierarchical or non-hierarchical structures or anything degree in between. More, I think what matters is a kind of fair and equitable distribution of resources, or how the kind of value of that organization is managed by its members. And so we could look at an ecosystem of DAOs where we have one DAO as a DAO B with many different teams and many different missions. But then that same ecosystem and same network topology from another splice can look completely different while still involving some of the same missions, teams, and ownership. And one of the promise of DAOs is that because programmable tokens can be distributed in a more granular way than traditional corporate interests, memberships or shares, the possibility for a new type of token holder company formation comes to the fore. So this means we can think more granularly about what membership means. We can also experiment with new forms of kind of governance. And yeah, I'll just say that for now. There was a earlier essay about the idea that was influential among many economists in the 20th century and kind of organizational theorists. Not wholly correct, and also its framing of efficiency and transaction costs can be quite limiting. But I would say it's core to the DAO imaginary is the idea that DAOs can become kind of member-owned organizations with much less kind of overhead or bureaucratic costs. And also the idea that within them, in kind of token holder companies or organizations or organisms, the Regen Network project is a really good example of how to incorporate tacit knowledge. So actual on the ground related experience in organizational governance. So right now they've set aside 30% of their tokens for land stewards, climate scientists, and other stakeholders in regenerative land management to form community DAOs that will participate in network governance and receive staking rewards because it's a proof of stake chain. I think this is interesting because it from the start basically says these are actual stakeholders of the network and we want them to be immediately involved. And I think that this is a good kind of interim solution. I think that we don't want to do coin voting in the future. So having this equal governance stake is not ideal, but having kind of economic value flow to different groups and different externalities is really important. And as we evolve different governance practices, they can be decoupled from this. And I'm working on the next essay related to like mutualism in an economic paradigm for decentralization. So I realized in this essay that I wrote before, I did not necessarily go into how this could be differentiated from a form of kind of stakeholder capitalism, which kind of preaches that the actual stakeholders of a system should be dealt in more, and that will fix the kind of externality and ethics questions of capitalism, right? But I think that still, and so there's one side where you deal in stakeholders, and then there's another side that I didn't talk about where you deal with kind of what the organization's aims are, the mission or the profit motive, and that will be dealt with later. But I still think and maintain that it's really important, later is in the next essay, but I still think it's really, really important that we keep stakeholdership in mind and really actively develop patterns to support more groups. And because so far tokens have primarily built worlds around speculation and exit, I think that's how the majority of kind of mainstream sees them, which is not wrong. And as new types of tokens emerge, they will build worlds around entrance too, attaching to how physical resources are governed. So as I said before, DAOs could be considered internet native organizations, but I don't think that they will only be that in the long term. And that's why we have to develop new norms around token voting governance. There's proof of personhood and identity systems. There's retroactive public goods funding. And I really believe at our core that we don't really know what tokens are yet. And they're in some sense like a new form of digital objects that will take time to establish norms around. So sometimes they look like a identity system, one person, one vote. Sometimes they look more like shares. Sometimes they look more like fee tokens and utility tokens. But we don't have, they're still in their horseless carriage phase, I would say. And I'm excited for them to change and be different. And for those of you in Denver, actually, if you see me in person, I have these little cards from our group Gnosis Guild, where we'll be doing kind of NFT tokens with an upgradable governance mechanism that, like, when you upgrade it, when you transfer it, the upgrade disappears, and you can't participate in governance if you've transferred it. But I have these little cards that will allow you to get one. So if you see me, ask for one. And basically, that's not me trying to shill this token to you. It's because there won't be like any monetary value for us in them at all. It will be, it's more that we just want to experiment with a different form of token governance than has been tried. And we won't make any money from them. So yeah, in summary, like when we look at DAOs, we see gamer guilds, cooperatives using software, group chats, and then people in the DAO ecosystem are like, oh my God, is this an entirely new organizational form in the history of human civilization? I would say right now it's not, but actually, like, it could be. Software is really new for organizations still in the long timeline of human history. And so what are the networks to come? So I would say their digital primacy allows some not to take seriously the fact that cooperatives, principals, gaming guilds, and auto-imaginaries like DAOs present an emergent organizational form with legitimate political relevance. And I think it's really, really important to have more groups start taking DAOs more seriously for several reasons. One of them is because they are so internet native and internet focused right now. If they do go on to become like really entrenched political forms, then a lot of people on the other side of the so-called digital divide will have kind of less legibility, literacy, and access to these political forms. So the quicker they have legitimacy as a political form, the more we can kind of make sure that it's accessible, right? Legitimacy and accessibility often go hand in hand. And to kind of wrap up with like a little speculative note, I'll read a little part from the essay. And basically this is, I think there's several different like political trajectories for DAOs, but this is one that I think we'll actually see kind of soon. So, like I said, to call attention to the chimeric term's failings at seriousness, many return to its misnomer. The A in DAO does not live up to its autonomous reference. So while others like researcher Adelaine invoke the political rather than a technical spirit of autonomy in DAOs, I think it's fantastic. And I would say that even though the term DAO, in my opinion, remains poetically correct, we could propose an occasional replacement, decentralized avatar organizations. Such organizations would take their political stakes both lightly and heavily. And as Audrey Tang notes, the days of avatar politicians are already here. You could consider avatar politicians virtual beings that represent, rally, and advocate on behalf of political platforms. And when automation increases, they may even spawn their own political platforms. It could look like, it could recognize the coming virtual zeitgeist, either collectively managed cyborg like Lil Michaela. I know Dapper Labs is working on DAOs and stuff now. Or an entire environment shaped by members like trusts moving castles. And I think that a lot of these practices will have collectively developed interoperable game worlds, engines, or virtual being mascots at their core, which co-create the culture around which their members organize. And as is the case with MMOs, I would say that DAOs are less technical protocols for governance and more high-stakes game worlds that interweave. And we could see something like DAO versus PAC, Political Action Committee, which are political fundraising vehicles, quite soon. And in this light, because of their potential importance, we should aim not just for technical protocols that work or for better distributed capitalism, but we have to think through like what DAOs mean is like evolving, living organizations, and essentially like and worlds. So I say and we should aim for not just running code, but we should aim for a rough consensus and running worlds. And that wraps up this portion of the talk. I will share this list of resources in this presentation, and you'll get to see more. I should probably update it. And yeah, if you want to read the essay, it's basically on our blog. There's a few more posts there related to Web3. I will pause for questions. I have a little bit more to say about the rest of our sessions, but I will pause for a minute to take any questions and also just for a breather.
Yes, please take a deep breath. Lots of stuff in the chat, Kia, that we can help you sift through. But yeah, take a second. Andy, how about you? Anything that stuck out to you in the chat as we give Kia a moment?
There are many things. Thank you, as always, for the engagement in the chat as the presentation unfolds. I'm so happy that more of us gets the opportunity to listen to Kia discuss some of these ideas and to hear some of her insights, which are invaluable. Some of the things which stand out to me, you know, it's always difficult. I have my every time Kia speaks, I'm like, oh my God, there's just 1,000 things that I want to say, but I will pull myself toward myself and focus instead on the questions that are in the chat. One of which, and it's perhaps the most interesting place to start, Kia, was around the notion of exit to community. And in that essay where you have IPO or corporate acquisition and exit to community, IPO and corporate acquisition have well-defined strategies with clear rationales, whereas exit to community is a more flexible concept at the moment. You proposed one alternative, this entrance, and I wonder if you can speak about, like, is exit a really healthy way to cultivate the kind of kindness and culture that you talked about? Or can we really begin to look at this thing of entrance and the management of physical resources as an alternative to the notion of exit and the kind of escape from responsibility that that might imply?
Sure, so I think it's probably not like an ideal use of language. But I really appreciate Nathan's work because I think he really mindfully incorporates very legible and accessible language in what he writes. So I think by using the term exit to community, and this also wasn't written primarily for like a crypto blockchain community. I think the primary audience for the piece was really like, you know, early mid-stage, you know, platform company owners who are basically like, you know, maybe like Y Combinator groups or whatever. And so like saying the term exit to community, I think was like, this is just my opinion, this could be totally off. I would be curious what he would say, but just is a kind of attempt to speak that language and to make that like more culturally accessible to the groups that are in this position at the moment. There's a question of whether that strategy is good on the long term because maybe it compromises too much from the beginning. But I do think like accessibility to the cultures you're working within was really, really important, right? I think that also now, like we've done, because it was written pretty early and like, you know, we've had the Uniswap experiment with the basically Uniswap kept it, well, now it's a common pattern, but it wasn't such a common pattern before, but basically kept it private that they would be doing a token and there would be a certain percentage of that token giving to people who had previously used the platform. And now that's quite a common pattern. And yeah, I think we've seen a lot of these kind of exits community things, and there's also been a lot of criticism of the Uniswap kind of token event of like actually not giving enough value to the community or enough meaningful governance power. For a while, I think you had to have a very, very, it might even still be the case, a very, very high amount of tokens to even make a proposal in the Uniswap governance platform. So I wouldn't like, we've done a lot of exit to community experiments now in the crypto space. And now I feel like there's probably ripe for like a new term or a new methodology that could come up where it's like, I like the Regen example of basically from the start, keeping a third of the economic value for identified stakeholders. I think like also build with, some people say build with community instead of exit to community. I think that's so-so. I think it's good to build with community and have community feedback for sure, but like I wouldn't say that structurally fixes the problem that exit to community is necessarily trying to fix. I think that there could be something where, like for our group Gnosis Guild, we build the Zodiac DAO tools, and we're really trying to prioritize membership of people who might not be the most likely subjects or likely suspects. So really trying to actively ask people to contribute and be involved and make sure that we have adequate payment for this type of labor. And like, yeah, it might be somewhere in between where it's just like, how I feel is like the value should be co-managed by all of the users. It shouldn't be that the value springs up and then is given to all the users. There's definitely like a right term for some disambiguation now, because it's clear that like the just token airdrop model is not like a prime governance model either, especially when users start expecting it.
There are a ton of other questions in the chat, and perhaps I have so many questions for you, but I want to throw it open and let others speak, and I will come back at the end maybe with one last.
Yeah, sure. How about Fang, Fang, if you wouldn't mind? And then I know some people have raised their hands, and then I think we have 30 minutes left, 35 minutes left on the calendar. Maybe we'll try to do 10 or 15 minutes, Kia, if that feels comfortable. Otherwise,
Sure.
we could. Okay, cool. Fang, please, if you don't mind.
I do have like, sorry, real quick. I do have like maybe like 30 seconds to a minute of slides left, just about the rest of the sessions too.
Great. We'll factor that in.
Yeah, hey Kia, thanks for the presentation. Really insightful. I wanted to ask you a question regarding one of the points that you touched in your presentation in the terms of retroactive public funding beyond the token voting governance. And then more specifically, how does that work? And if you can elaborate a bit more on that.
Sure. So that was one of, I can also share it in the Slack channel. That was one of the proposals in the community to kind of combat just token voting governance, is also to basically, and also because like as a kind of funding stream opposed to the typical token model where you raise and then basically the token is also a governance token. So it happened, I'm thinking of the name like with optimism and like a layer 2, basically being able to like retroactively fund a project that's identified as a public good. So the idea that it's publicly accessible and serves a kind of civic function, to be able to then kind of retroactively identify it and kind of either stake on the project's success and pay it retroactively or otherwise. I'll send the longer essay and the example in the chat, but just as an idea that you use tokens more to fund public goods after their completion, rather than using funds to raise and then do governance of those projects.
Got it. Understood. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Fang. Cesar, I think you have your hand raised, please.
Yes, thank you. So I'm working to create a DAO for the Forward Party, which is Andrew Yang's party. With and so this is more like a grassroots extension to the party. And we're also working on some ballot initiatives to pass the combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. And so the focus of the DAO is like, in the political landscape. And so I don't have like one particular question. I mean, I have a lot of them, but I would like to just kind of connect and like learn more in that. So I just want to ask if that was okay for me to connect with you and, go from there.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to DM me on the on Slack. You'll see I've posted in the like Guild DAOs, DAO Guild channel. So you'll find my username there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. That was it.
See Glenn Pope with a question, if Glenn, you're willing.
I was curious how you think about progressive decentralization when you're starting something and you're kind of getting to product market fit and then thinking about how to do that ultimate decentralization that exits community. Like, what have you been seeing that's working well? Are there tactics of how you kind of move from one end of the scale to the other? Like, how do you think about the kind of more tactical pieces of that?
Yeah, so I feel like progressive decentralization is really good. And I mean, all of Jesse's work is amazing. Jesse wrote an essay about progressive decentralization and a playbook for projects related to this, I think, and I want to say in 2019, maybe 2020. Maybe even earlier, I forget. But I think it was really good for the time, and also Nathan had a good point in his presentation that like sufficient decentralization was a kind of mandate for a lot of crypto projects in the beginning that came from regulation, and that almost by default, a lot of projects had to embrace or did embrace this decentralization macro, and that it led to a lot of interesting experimentation, and that the progressive decentralization kind of meme actually came in response to like a lot of projects trying to decentralize from the start before they had like many users, let's say. Users isn't a great term, but you know what I mean. For example, at Gnosis, we did a few software platforms and immediately gave them to the DX DAO. So we initialized the DAO, and the DAO had ownership, and totally independent community took them on and really built them up. But that was before those platforms had an organic community or user base, let's say. So progressive decentralization was the idea that you find product market fit, and then you give the platform to the community. So you have a small team that can execute supposedly efficiently, and then basically give that value to the community. So very similar a little bit to the exit to community kind of roadmap. I think now that we've seen so many DAOs with different types of missions that like we can't generalize to that degree anymore. Like there's no, and also different DAOs have different types of risks. And so there's no like mandate for a specific type of decentralization to go to for any DAO now. I would say what matters most is that DAOs, however decentralized or centralized they may be, are just very clear about process and very clear about their actual structure. That matters more than like getting to like some grail of decentralization. Sorry, that doesn't exactly answer the question, but how I see it is like the counter meme that I would offer now is that DAOs should preserve in their tech stack like a possibility for optionality of decentralization. So basically starting with something like contracts like the Gnosis Safe or any kind of account standard at their core, and then basically slowly over time add on different governance practices or evolve and embed different governance practices. So whether it's voting at the beginning, maybe it's conviction voting, maybe it's like orcas, pods, so small groups working together, basically adding on this functionality over time with like a rough North Star of like, what does decentralization actually accomplish? And why does it accomplish something meaningful for this project? Because if there isn't an actual benefit, or if you aren't actually giving value to a wider community, then you've kind of lost your North Star. So just preserving optionality, knowing that your organization will evolve, and thinking like, what benefits do decentralization actually afford my project? And like, what's the rough roadmap to get there? Rather than assuming that, you know, you follow this one by one and you launch a token. In terms of specific concrete things, sorry, this is a long answer. So for example, like I think Prime DAO does a pretty good job, where Prime DAO is basically one DAO that is raised, but has a ton of different like sub projects and ecosystems that work together. They have Collectivo, which is like a local exchange regenerative finance project. They have obviously all the Prime products, a bunch of other things that I'm blanking on. But basically they've gone from not decentralization to like of users necessarily, but decentralizing their organization to many, many small organizations. I love that. Like that should be the goal, where like maybe a DAO is a collection of resources and a bunch of aligned organizations can go to this DAO for these resources and commit to like high level values But then that DAO can spread those resources further, and then those orgs can spread them further. So to me, that would be a preferred approach than like the tokenization approach.
Yeah,
Love
super
that.
helpful.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, I think I see Marlon with the hand raised, and then there's at least one or two threads that I can tug on, maybe to bring some.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, in the last answer, you gave a lot of pathways to this question, but probably in the kind of a little bit of abstract level, can you say a little bit more about the kind of leaderless, leaderful continuum that I think in a project that I'm trying to lead and leading is called Motion DAO. That there is that enormous tension. It's like how can we lead, and at the same time this emergence of leaders, and what kind of structures can we use? But yeah, so that's a question in relation to leaderless and leaderful.
So I've been kind of favoring, and this opinion for me changes all the time, or like transforms. Right now, I feel like we can kind of think of DAOs as like agents that like we all make up a part of, rather than like a company that we work for. But also it's also not like the DAO can ever have a leader. It's just a kind of agent of resources, values, other things, and how I would approach it is potentially like. And I do kind of think that the form of networks is like multi-organizational is probably correct. So the idea that a DAO is this kind of like agent that we make up of, or almost like egregore sort of thing, and that there are multiple teams that interact with that DAO and interact with each other and collaborate. And that I think it's up to those teams, like how they structure themselves. So it could be that like, one team works really well with a typical kind of firm-like structure. It could be that one team is really flat. The main thing that I would encourage is like developing really sound processes with people that you work with, and looking towards folks like Rich from Lumio's Patterns for Decentralized Organizing to see like, can these patterns help my team work together better? And just developing what feels like healthy and kind of like culturally good in your teams, and then allowing that to like permeate throughout the DAO. I think it matters less leader, not leader, as long as there's like a mutual respect and a fair distribution of resources. Yeah.
One last one from me, then maybe one from Andy. Hierarchy seems like it's taking some space, and then we'll make some time for Kia, your last slides. A big, rich part of the conversation in chat centered around first bounties and just kind of like your offhand comment about that, but then kind of evolved from there into Juan and Salim being interested in just other mechanisms outside of bounties that seem like they might fit better. One Galaxy Brain little chat message from Juan that I'm trying to find was, I think it said bounties for, maybe Juan, you can say it, bounties for, wait, one second.
What about UBI for exploration and bounties for specialization?
Yes.
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't hear. Bounties for?
Was UBI for experimentation and bounties for specialization. And I think like that was just an idea, but the broader conversation seemed to be around just like incentive mechanisms within DAOs. And I know we were both at Shelling Point yesterday. I heard Penvala talk about collective action. I heard Mark Balin talk about dilutive DAOs and the different ways that these decisions make impact. So you could take it as broad or as narrow as you'd like, but just curious your thoughts on these possibilities.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of just bounties in general because they tend to be like really short-sighted and for a specific discrete task. And I think, the one thing that DAOs, if they learn anything from cooperatives, I think could learn their focus on long-termism. I mean, it could be that some DAOs are really like flash mission DAOs that like, you know, come together to do one thing and then they do it and they dissolve. I think that's also cool. But I think for DAOs that aim on a kind of broader mission, like a long-termism in terms of, I don't think that we can do long-termism only in incentives, but I think that we can do it through values. And I think bounties really incentivize short-term contribution and discrete contribution. And also, if we're talking specifically because a lot of DAOs still just build software, if you have multiple different groups building a complex software application, no one has overall kind of, I mean, this happens just with complex projects by default eventually, but a software project that sits together from different bounties will often have a lack of coherency in the overall project, and won't actually be technically super sound most of the time. Like you probably want a team who's been working together for some time, who's done multiple iterations, and bounties don't really create that. It can work for smaller things, but like you don't want a bridge where each component is built by like a different firm with a bounty. So I think being able to have a kind of long-term investment in a project feels important for complex technical projects. I also think for like Toby had a talk at Shilling Point yesterday about how there's like a real limitation of incentive design to actually create values. And I think values come like subtly nuanced and implicitly, and that bounties are not a format that will create a kind of social fabric of values. So what I would prefer instead is kind of like, if we look at like missions and milestones, I think it's still really useful. Like in our team, we do basically like 6-week cycles and then 2-week cooldowns. We're going to do a little zodiac calendar for it. So we still have a kind of milestone and mission calendar and like sprint calendar. So it's not against sprints, but basically we have these aligned to larger objectives over time. So for each sprint, we'll give like a little bit towards that, but there's still like a North Star towards which we're contributing. So I think that like having like chains of bounties that actually just look like large scale projects is much more the way to go. Yeah.
Amazing. Kia, one thing that's I'm dying to ask you is to say a few more words about DAOs as mnemonic organizations, particularly as it relates to justice. We have these 8 beautiful tarot cards, one of which is justice. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on memory, institutional form, documentation, and justice.
Sure. So I think the other side of them being like mnemonic or like memory making institutions is that there's a lot of public alarm over a lot of things related to blockchain stuff. And it's so crazy to me because to me, the thing I'm most worried about is privacy. And that doesn't seem to have entered like the public kind of critique as much as it should have yet. And I think it's a huge issue, you know, with all transactions by default being public on Ethereum. So now we have things like ZK, like zero knowledge proofs and other things to hopefully do private but confirmable transactions. I also am a fan of the DarkFi squad and that manifesto for basically making, and the NIM project and Nunembra, a lot of Cosmos projects basically building privacy by default into the protocol. I think those are super important. There's the old, it's been repeated a lot, but the old cypherpunk adage of like basically privacy, or sorry, I'm really tired, so my English, but that privacy should be by default for citizens, but for the powerful, there should be an expectation of publicness. So I think that a lot of the norms this year will settle around like what should be public and what should be private. And for me, it's like, I'm still figuring out the exact articulation of it that I think will be helpful. But I would say that like for institutions that should have some form of civic accountability, so that say they're building software that we expect the general public to use, that they should have relatively transparent actions, and that their institution should have a public budget, and that how they spend that should probably be public and accessible. And also, you know, if you have a large institution or DAO that's like acting supposedly in public service, you probably want to see who's donating to it, or well, there's so much gray area with all this, but the overall point is that I think the norms of like institutions should be public and have long-term memory, but I think that individual actions should be by default private and be chosen to be public when they want to be, because I think that like human psychology has never really lived with immutable memory in its social systems, and we don't have we haven't developed enough reparative systems to combat immutability yet for it to be like a healthy civic function on a personal level. So to me, the answer to that question is the justice really depends on where the norms around privacy fall. Yeah.
Wow. I want to ask you questions about the stars and zodiac now, but we'll save that for another session. There is it's wonderful commentary from Jocelyn as well, but I want to give you time to do the last few slides. And then perhaps we can tell this party to gather town, depending on Vivek.
Oh, should I do the slides now?
Please.
Okay, cool. I'll try to be very quick. I'll probably skip over a couple. I just wanted to give a little bit more context for what we'll be doing. Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah. So this is the event description, but basically this first session I just did the presentation, went a little bit longer than I thought, but the rest will be much more interactive, hopefully. And as I said, we'll kind of do them as scenario-driven sessions where the different things will happen in your DAO, and basically we'll have to come up with a response. And that can be both things like proposals we want to put forward, but also technical tools we have at hand to relate to the scenarios. And basically this is a little bit up for debate, but we wanted to also kind of potentially take it as a DAO that we're all forming together and basically have a common goal. So we have one potential common goal, but it's open to other things, is that I'll be working with my little team in guilds. We'll be working on a wiki projects called zodiac.wiki. Right now it will just be a media wiki, so the software that Wikipedia is using. And the aim will be to document kind of different DAO pattern languages or design patterns. So things of like, oh, your DAO has developed different working groups. What's the best way to respond to that? So similar to how we'll be kind of structuring the sessions now, and a kind of like iterative vernacular language, almost like how you would build a building through a bunch of different patterns. We have a greenhouse, a garden growing wild, and that the collection of these patterns inevitably make a building or something like it. So we'll be kind of constructing DAO patterns to advise people on it, and anyone can edit the wiki. So some examples here. But of course, pattern languages and wikis themselves are never really fully living languages unless they're kind of culturally embedded in part of like a shared practice. So that's why we're doing it as a wiki format. So the idea is that anyone can join and edit the public wiki, zodiac.wiki, that we'll be creating. And we want to create a common resource for the ecosystem. And I'll probably actually go over this a little bit more in depth in the next session, but I just don't want to do too much more info dumping. But basically, we want to allow contributors to the project also to add to the wiki over time. And admin and governance abilities will be conferred by upgradable Zodiac NFTs. But basically, one thing this DAO could do is document, rather than like DAO best practices, because they're changing all the time, like potential DAO patterns, a kind of type of language that is a little bit more living. Yeah, that's it. But basically it will be, you can already go to zodiac.wiki, and if you're interested in the project, also feel free to enter your email here or find me in Denver and I can give you one of the little cards. But potentially one outcome of our DAO could be that we document DAO design practices. Yeah, that's it really. I'll go into a little bit clearer detail in it in the next session.
I'm excited to spend a little time on that last slide too. It seemed like a cool excerpt. But thank you, Kei. Thank you for setting us up so well for an adventure ahead. And I am, for one, quite excited about the idea of developing such a pattern language and to use our environment of exploration as an idea generating space. So thank you everyone for being with us. We will pop in the GatherTown link right now for just kind of like 10 minutes of hanging out. And I'll put that in the chat here. I'll also save the chat given there are some people who have dropped their emails, Kei, and given we have the recording, we should be able to just like get them all to you. So that is the GatherTown link. We can queue up some music on the way out, but pop in there. Thank you again to Kei, and we'll see you all in a few weeks for the next session.
Cool, thank you all. I'm looking forward to meeting you in GatherTown.
Thank you, Kei. Amazing presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is amazing.